What's up, YouTube? It's the one and only legend of winning, aka Low, and I'm back with by far my most interesting trade video I've uploaded on this channel. So for those out there who've been underneath the rock or just don't know what's going on, the Detroit Pistons decided to trade a few starters and some draft picks for Blake Griffin. And quite honestly, there are just a lot of questions that are unanswered because this is by far the most out of nowhere trade I have seen in the last 10 to 15 years, especially since I've been having this YouTube channel. So when it comes to this trade, there's just so many questions that are unanswered. A lot of people are really concerned about the Pistons and the Clippers and the direction that they're moving into. And I sat back, slept on it, woke up, and I felt basically the exact same that I did when I went to sleep. However, it just wasn't as serious as I possibly thought it was. My initial thoughts were the Pistons lost this trade, and even right now, I still feel that way. And then when it comes to the Clippers, I'm not completely clear on what exactly they're doing, especially because there's been so many reports and rumors that they're still trying to be competitive, which again doesn't make any sense. However, if there are two things I know, there's this. One, the Clippers are indeed rebuilding, which is something that many people have anticipated over the last several seasons. The Clippers over the past 5 to 6 seasons have been a rerun of a really bad episode of a 90s sitcom. Every single year, very predictable, they would go into the NBA season projected to win around 50 wins despite the fact that they didn't have a starting caliber small forward, and then right on cue, Blake Griffin or Chris Paul would suffer an injury, they would thus get knocked out in the first or second round, and then we would do this all over again for literally 5 to 6 seasons. However, I believe a lot of people assumed that this rerun was coming to a conclusion in the beginning of the season as Chris Paul decided to demand a trade to the Houston Rockets. Without Chris Paul, who was an elite level point guard, who was dishing the dimes out to both Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan, Lob City was no longer, and thus a lot of people just assumed that they were going to move in a different direction. However, when they signed Blake Griffin to the massive contract that they signed him to, 5-year, $170+ million, it seems as if they felt comfortable with making Blake Griffin the face of the franchise, and one day, and possibly this still will happen, hanging up his jersey in the Raptors, as the Clippers still have no identity despite the fact that they've been in the NBA for several decades now. But there was still one more plot twist that many people were still trying to solve, and that is DeAndre Jordan on an expiring contract and what exactly he's going to do in his upcoming free agent season. So rumor has it that the Clippers and DeAndre Jordan sat down, had open and honest dialogue, and they came out that conversation with the understanding that DJ was going to leave. So thus started this rebuilding process, and quite frankly, it makes sense. I know a lot of people, especially Clipper fans, are upset that they now no longer have Blake Griffin, and I think a lot of people just don't thoroughly understand basketball enough to understand that Blake Griffin really is not a face of a franchise. It's just so happened that the Clippers are just that poorly managed, especially over the past 5 to 6 years, that was all they were left with. However, if DeAndre Jordan isn't going to be there for the long haul, then this team is not even going to make the playoffs, especially in the Western Conference. So if that was the case, you might as well trade Blake Griffin, as his stock is as high as it will ever be, especially due to his injury history along with his contract situation. So in return, they receive Avery Bradley, who is on an expiring contract, so he's not really that much of an asset. Boban, who's literally one trade away from being an NBA journeyman. Tobias Harris, who in my opinion is by far the most valuable player in this transaction. Yes, I understand Blake Griffin is a better player when healthy. However, Tobias Harris, he's younger, he has a lot more promise, versatility is way better, especially on the defensive end compared to Blake Griffin, and financially, there's no ifs, ands, buts about it. Tobias Harris is on one of the better contracts in the NBA. So moving forward, Tobias Harris is a piece that they more likely will use either A, while they're rebuilding, or B, as a trading piece because he is very valuable in today's NBA. And then comes in the draft picks, a first round pick that is top 4 protected for the first 3 years, and then if it's not conveyed after the 3rd year, it becomes unprotected, and then a second round pick, which who knows what's going to happen with either one of those picks. In my opinion, Doc Rivers, he's not that great when it comes to drafting players. However, on the flip side, that's the reason why you brought in Jerry West, or at least part of the reason, because he's definitely a guru when it comes to finding really solid, talented pieces later on in the draft, which is very interesting when it comes to the Pistons, because even though, yes, it is top 4 protected, because it's not as if the Pistons are a shoo-in to make the postseason. Which then leads us to the Pistons. And even though, yes, I know a lot of people are going to say that I'm hating on the Pistons are just a desperate team who made a very desperate move. Before the season began, many people had high expectations for the Pistons. Me, myself, I didn't. For those out there who saw my NBA preview, I clearly stated that the Pistons were going to be by far one of the most disappointing, if not the most disappointing team in the NBA, and so far, they have proven me right. This organization, and even though yes, I understand Reggie Jackson has suffered injuries and he's been sidelined, which I also predicted before the season began. However, Reggie Jackson is not an all-star, let alone a superstar that plays at a level in which he should be able to single-handedly determine the wins or losses on an organization. That team just isn't that good at all, and people just need to recognize that for what it is. So now that that is extremely clear, does that thus mean that Blake Griffin will be a great fit for this team? And in my opinion, I'm going to say no. See, my first initial thoughts were that they could possibly figure it out and somehow work it together. However, I started to realize that they gave up Avery Bradley and Tobias Harris to get Blake Griffin, which means that when it comes to their ability to space the floor and knock down threes, they are severely lacking. When you look at players such as Tobias Harris and Avery Bradley, I understand many people believe that Avery Bradley was having a poor season, which he was. He definitely wasn't as efficient as he has been in prior seasons. However, those two players were by far the best three-point marksmen this season. And when you look at their percentages as a team, which is 4th in the NBA, this is by far one of the better teams that are able to space the floor on a consistent basis. Now that you plugged in Blake Griffin on a team that more likely has to give players such as Stanley Johnson more minutes, which again, like I said in the beginning of the season, he's not that good of a player either. Now you're talking about shrinking the floor so much so that spacing is going to become very problematic. And I know a lot of people want to point out the fact that Blake Griffin, he starts to shoot threes, he's spacing out the floor a little bit more, which I guess is true to his own standards. However, still to this day, Blake Griffin, despite the fact that he's having a career year from behind the arc, it's still below league average. And then when it comes to his mid-range shot, it is vastly below league average. And I didn't even know this, Blake Griffin is shooting below 30% from mid. So even though, yes, Blake Griffin, he has somewhat of a shot, it's nowhere near as consistent enough as it should be, especially since Chris Paul isn't on the team anymore, because obviously Chris Paul, he attracts much more attention from the defense, which thus freed up Blake Griffin for easier open looks. So when it comes to Blake Griffin, at this point in his career, unfortunately, he is a stereotypical athletic forward, someone who doesn't space the floor, who became heavily dependent on a point guard, and he can't stay healthy at all. I mean, if you go down the list of forwards who have been vastly athletic, they have suffered a very similar fate that Blake Griffin has suffered over his entire career. And it's been rather consistent when it comes to Blake Griffin, especially over the last 3 seasons, which is why I'm completely confused to why so many people believe that Blake Griffin is this franchise player or even could get the label as being a quote-unquote star. Blake Griffin has not been an all-star over the last 3 years, and even if he was healthy in the Western Conference, I still don't believe he would have been able to accomplish said feat. Then you move into the East, and yes, it should be a little bit more easier. However, when you start to realize that other young teams such as the Milwaukee Bucks and the Philadelphia 76ers are on the rise, it may make it a little bit more tougher for Blake Griffin as time continues to progress. However, I will say this about the Pistons. Now that they have Blake Griffin, it does speed up the process in which they are able to win because they now have a legitimate 2 to 4 year window to attack and take advantage of a conference that is making a massive transition, especially if LeBron doesn't return to the Eastern Conference after this season. However, that still means a lot of things has to go in their favor. They still have to make sure they bring a point guard that is better than Reggie Jackson to this team. 2, Blake Griffin still has to stay healthy for about, let's say, 90 plus games because he has to stay healthy during the regular season plus the postseason, which is something he hasn't been able to do for 3 going on 4 years now. And then you still have to figure out what you're going to do with the rest of the floor spacing because it's definitely problematic when you got rid of your 2 best 3-point shooters. But the worst part about all of this is that if Blake Griffin doesn't stay healthy or this whole experiment just doesn't work out for them, there's a huge possibility, and more than likely this is what's going to happen, the Pistons more than likely will be stuck with the worst contract in the NBA. Blake Griffin, at the age of 33, is owed nearly $40 million. At this stage of Blake Griffin's career, with his abilities, his talents, and his injury history, there's no way that any team in the NBA should have been willing to pay him that type of money outside the Clippers. And now that you look at the Pistons moving forward, especially since they already have Drummond, financially speaking, you don't have any room to add anyone of significance. So basically, you're just praying and hoping that the pieces that you have on the team, players such as Luke Kennard, Stanley Johnson, Reggie Bullock, those players will eventually develop and become consistent three-point shooters who you can plug into the starting lineup and hope for the best. But even with that being said, we're being very optimistic for the Pistons just so they can be at a 4th seed in the Eastern Conference, more than likely going to get bounced in the 2nd round, and this is going to be a consistent theme throughout Blake Griffin's career. But please let me know what you believe about this transaction in the comment section below. Also, for the people out there who are anticipating the podcast, tonight or tomorrow, more than likely tonight, I'm going to upload the DeMarcus Cousins podcast, and then tomorrow me and Agent will sit down and record this podcast when we're talking about the Drummond and some more trade rumors. So that should be uploaded around Wednesday or Thursday. So keep in touch. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to the channel and to all of the podcast platforms. And I'll see you all next time. Peace.